Next on Encore Book Notes, Peter Brimelow. He sat down in 1995 to discuss Alienation, Common Sense About America's Immigration Disaster. It's an hour.
Peter Brimelow, author of Alienation. What's the general thesis of your book?
Oh, Brian, just that immigration is out of control. The immigration was triggered, mass immigration was triggered again by the 1965 Act. Nobody expected the numbers would be as large. They didn't expect that it would be dominated by just 15 countries, which is what's happened. They didn't expect that the skill levels would deteriorate sharply because of the perverse level the Act works. And they just had no idea any of this was going to happen. But of course, once it happened, it's become a sacrosanct subject and people are afraid to discuss it. The country is being transformed against its will, by accident, in a way that's unprecedented in the history of the world, to no visible economic gain, incidentally, and you're not supposed to talk about it, so of course I couldn't resist.
When did you first get the idea to do this book?
I've been interested in immigration forever. Most immigrants are, you know, I mean, because they actually know something about the way the system works. But the book itself stems from a cover story I did in National Review in about 1992, in which National Review basically broke with the conservative consensus that immigration was a good thing and more immigration is a better thing and so on. And we started to ask questions about it, and that really provoked quite a civil war in the conservative community. It's an issue that goes across political lines.
Why did National Review break with the general conservative principle on this subject?
I guess we've just been having a lot of internal discussions on it. And it happens that the editor of National Review, John O'Sullivan, is also a British immigrant, and so, like most immigrants, immigration appears to him to be an interesting issue. Opinion polls, you know, show immigrants really worry about immigration, in fact, even more than the native-born.
When you take this position in public, what's the general reaction in this country?
Oh, well, it depends where you take it. It's an issue where there's a chasm between the leadership, the political leadership and the intellectual leadership of the country and the people at large. Immigration is massively and fantastically unpopular in the country at large. It's not at all unusual for me to be on a talk show and have 100% supportive calls. But with the media elite, it's become sort of an icon. So I get, you know, very savage reviews. If it wasn't for electronic media, I would probably be in quite serious trouble.
What would happen if I wanted to emigrate to China?
You can't. In Alienation, we've called up all the major immigrant sending countries and said, we're an American citizen, how do we go about emigrating to you? The Chinese just flatly said you couldn't do it. The Mexicans said you have to get a tourist visa for which you have to show financial assets. You go in person to the embassy, to the ministry in Mexico City, you apply. If it's not been granted in 6 months, you have to go out and start all over again. The Indians said, are you of Indian heritage? They mean race. And when we said we weren't, they just hung the phone up on us. Apparently, it is technically possible to immigrate to India. 50,000 Indians a year come here. It's technically possible to immigrate to India as an American citizen, but it's extraordinarily difficult because there's a lot of hoops you've got to go through.
What if I want to be a German citizen?
It's quite difficult there, but it does happen. It can be done. There aren't the total barriers that there are in most of these third world countries.
What have the Germans done with their 1.5 million Turks?
Well, they had a lot of guest workers. Guest workers, they brought them in and they were supposed to go back eventually, and of course they didn't, and they've started a fairly large population in Germany, which is still essentially Turkish, and it's a problem for them. Their biggest problem is asylum, though. See, they started to have people showing up at the borders asking for asylum, and it's the greatest asylum disaster in the world, actually. They eventually got up to something like 60,000 a month coming in. Before they cut it off. Now that happens here too. There's about 100,000 asylum applicants here. And as a practical matter, once they arrive, they're never thrown out.
I think I heard a statistic there was something like 500,000 Koreans in Los Angeles alone. What if I want to become a Korean?
You can't do it. They just say no, you can't immigrate. And the same with Taiwan, and the same with mainland China. The Japanese they don't even keep official statistics on immigrants. They don't recognize the concept of an immigrant in their statistics. When we asked them about it, they said, oh, well, they get 1 or 2 boat people or something, but ho, 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 they don't stay. They go off to someplace else like the US. So there's no reciprocity at all here. It's not like free trade where people insist that you've got to drop your tariff barriers if we drop our tariff barriers. It just doesn't apply.
France.
I haven't checked the French, but my impression is it can be done, but it's relatively difficult.
All right, how about Great Britain?
Same thing. I haven't checked Europe.
You haven't
'Cause
checked?
no, I didn't check Europe because Europe was choked off by the 65 Act. The Europeans are not major centres of immigrants anymore. I mean, they could be. There are people who want to leave, for example, Eastern Europe, but the system is so inflexible that it won't let it happen. Unless, of course, they were to come here illegally. We have 300,000 to 500,000 net illegals every year. But by and large, people from the First World don't seem to want to do that. There are a few illegal Italians and so on, but 3/4 of all the illegals here are Hispanics.
What's the 65 Act?
Well, the 1965 Immigration Act really kicked off mass immigration after a 40-year lull. It was put through by Senator Kennedy, and what they did was they tried to abolish the previous system which had been set up in the 1920s, which favoured the countries from which most Americans had come, and also cut the levels down. And so they said they were going to treat all countries in the world equally. That was the purpose of it. A foolish purpose in my view, because immigration policy is inherently discriminatory. You have to make choices. Even if you go to open borders, the country next door is going to benefit. But in fact, because they also included family reunification as a principle, it's allowed the first 15 countries, the first few countries to get an immigration chain going, were able to shoulder aside all other immigrants. So it didn't work in any way like anybody expected.
How long have you been in the States?
Me, I came here in 1970 to go to Stanford, the business school. And then at 72, I graduated, and the INS told me I had to leave, so I obediently did. And then I came back again from Canada in 1979.
Your wife Maggie's from Canada.
That's right.
Did you meet her there?
Yes, I did, although I was living in Washington when I married her, and she had to come from Paris, where she was then living. And she felt it was a step down.
What was a step down coming to the States?
Moving her from Paris to Washington, she felt was she's a Francophile. No, she's very happy here, like most Canadians.
Are you a citizen?
Yes.
Why did you become a citizen, and how hard was it?
You know, I was actually very slow about becoming a citizen, partly because just inertia, and partly because I didn't want to break the news to my mother and all kinds of things. I became a citizen after my son was born 3 years ago.
Alexander?
Yes, indeed.
Born here?
Yeah. And he's a citizen, of course, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, even though we weren't citizens when he was born.
What's the 14th Amendment? What did it do for...
Well, the 14th Amendment was originally passed to prevent southern states from disenfranchising the blacks after the Civil War. But it's been interpreted to mean that anybody who's here, anybody who's here and has a child, even if they're here illegally, that child is automatically a citizen. And it's created a real minor industry on the southern border, because people do cross the border to have children here, because those children are citizens and they're eligible for welfare. That's a point I bring up in Alien Nation. There's surveys which show this irrefutably.
What was your mother's reaction when you became a citizen?
She was sort of resigned, I guess. She was sort of resigned to it. I guess I've been here a long time by now.
Where is she now?
She's in England.
Where?
In the north of England. She lives in Birkenhead, which is sort of the Brooklyn of Liverpool.
Where did you go to school in Great Britain?
In the north. What are here called public schools in the north. In other words, I didn't go to a private school, which, as you know, in Britain are called public schools. So,
what did you study?
I was fundamentally arts type, and we did economics and history at university in England, my brother and I. I'm an identical twin. And then we went to Stanford, the business school at Stanford, to convert two essentially useless literary intellectuals into something useful. And in his case, it took, and he became a real person. You know, he's now a stockbroker on Wall Street.
Is he a citizen?
Yeah, but in my case, it didn't take, and I reverted to this half-world of financial journalism.
Identical twin?
Yes.
Did you become a citizen at the same time?
No, no.
How did he do it?
He's done it more recently.
Why did he do it?
I think there's a point at which you realize you're going to spend your life here. The problem with the English, you know, is that they don't feel themselves to be foreign here, so they're actually quite slow to naturalize.
Maggie, a Canadian, is she a citizen?
No, we have real resistance there. The Canadians are reluctant to do it, but we'll see.
Can I become a Canadian citizen?
Well, you know, it's actually more difficult than it was some years ago for Americans to get in. But you could get into Canada because they have a much more flexible immigration system than the Americans do. They award people points, potential immigrants points on the basis of whether they speak the national languages, which of course is not a consideration here at all, and on skills. And they do import quite, there is a steady trickle of American immigration into Canada.
If you had
But actually, one of the tragedies of the current situation is that it's, both in the US and in Canada, is that it's cut back on reciprocal immigration between the two countries. There were 40,000 Canadians a year coming in prior to 1965, but it was choked off by the 65 Act. And I think that's a really serious problem, because I actually think I lived in Canada for years. I think the relationship between the Americans and the Canadians is the most important for both countries. If the better the Canadians and the Americans get on, the less they have to worry about the rest of the world.
If you could do exactly what you think ought to be done with immigration in this country today, what would you do?
Well, right now we have no good options, no pleasant options. I think there should be a moratorium for 5, 10, 15 years until the situation's gotten under control. I think illegal immigration should be absolutely stopped. I actually think the illegals here should be deported, as they were in the 1950s. The Eisenhower administration did that. And then there should be a national debate, and immigration should be designed in some rational way. Maybe lower levels, maybe higher skills, but the question is, what do Americans want? We shouldn't allow it to just happen by accident. And of course, we shouldn't beat down all discussion with the usual cries of racist and xenophobe and nativist and all this nonsense.
Why not?
Why what?
Why shouldn't we beat it down with all the cries of xenophobia and things like that?
Because there's a real issue here. I mean, because of the peculiar way the 65 Act has worked, the US has embarked on a demographic transformation which is without precedent in the history of the world, on the one hand. And on the other hand, you can't show that it's of any particular economic benefit to the US. The best academic work on this subject shows that having 9% of the workforce foreign is probably worth about 1/10 of 1% of GDP to the native-born Americans. It's wiped out, actually, by the welfare loss.
Hold on a second on that statistic. 9% of the 260 million people that live in the United States are foreign-born?
Right.
Are they citizens?
No, not all of them, no. I think about a third are citizens. Matter of fact, half of them have told the census that they can't speak English. 45%, I think.
Why should they speak English?
Well, it goes to the question of, are they creating enclaves, and are they, in fact, assimilating to the national community? A nation-state normally, essentially requires a common culture and a common language. I don't see how it's going to work without it. Census Bureau has just found that there's a new category of native-born Americans, 2% of native-born Americans who can't speak English. They're not bilingual, they can't speak English. That goes to the creation of enclaves by this great surge of immigration since 1965. Most immigrants go to 6 states, you see, so it's heavily concentrated.
Which 6?
California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois.
Why do they pick those states?
Who knows?
Let me just, while we're doing this, I've got this map here. We'll take a full shot of it. And this is in your book. What is this?
Well, this is from the 1990 census. And what it shows is, it's difficult to show in black and white, but what it shows is that, first of all, immigrants are going to creating these great enclaves right through the country.
What are the dark areas?
Well, the dark area on the left-hand side, California and Texas, that's the great Hispanic arc of settlement. And the very darkest area in there is areas where Hispanics are over 50%. There are several counties in South Texas now where Hispanics are over 99%. There's a dotted area around the Bay Area in San Francisco and around Orange County. Asians go there. Those are counties that are more than 10% Asian, although Asians are only like 3% of the population.
What about all that light gray area? What's that mean?
The lightest gray, the gray area and the very lightest gray area, whites are above 75%, and in the lightest areas above 95% of the population. You see, the arrows, Brian, are actually the other interesting thing. Those arrows are native-born Americans moving away from the areas of immigrant impact. It's a trend that was picked up in the 1990 census by Bill Fry at the University of Michigan. He calls it the flight from diversity. And they're going to completely separate areas of the country. The whites go up to the white heartland, the blacks to great black metropolis of the south. So the country's coming apart ethnically under the impact of this great wave of immigration. It's an amazing spectacle.
What's wrong with that?
Well, my general take on that is what's right with it. And this has all been done by public policy, so the people in favour of it have got to show what the purpose of it is. But to make a suggestion, is this one nation indivisible? I mean, we're creating here societies which are going to be as different as any on the face of the earth. They're going to be different racially, they're going to be different culturally, because there's no, we have multiculturalism now. We don't have Americanization that we had in 1900. And they're going to be different linguistically, because we're now educating the different languages, and language retention is very high among some groups, particularly the Mexicans. So is this going to hold together?
You know that you're criticized for being the last man in, and you want to shut the gates. Now, what do you say to that?
I say it's a question of is the fortress going to fall? Is the boat going to capsize? I mean, in other words, just because I'm the last onto the lifeboat, does that mean I'm not supposed to point out that it's going to capsize? There are important factual issues here. Alien Nation is basically a book about facts. It's a book about the census data, it's a book about economic literature, which I translate into English, and about history, immigration history, which people don't know anything about. Immigration is not continuous to this country. There are long pauses, things like that. And my attitude is the truth is an absolute defense in these things. If you've got to show, you've got to show there's something wrong with the book to really affect my sort of equanimity. And nobody's been able to do that yet, thank goodness.
Before we started the interview, you said that you'd been in a couple of debates today, then it was actually shouting matches. Why are you creating an atmosphere that people shout at each other?
I think the facts create the atmosphere, really. People don't want to recognize that this transformation is underway and is caused by public policy. There's a tremendous emotional commitment to immigration on the part of American intellectuals and some categories of them, and they just don't like being disturbed. I mean, the typical print review of this book is, you know, what a horrible man, what a horrible book. Of course, we all know there's something wrong with immigration. I mean, for example, the Business Week review by Chris Farrell, he said, ugly Jeremiad, he called this book. And then he said, of course, we all know there's a skill level problem, because skills have been skewed downwards by the 65 Act, the funny way it works. Well, they did a cover story. He did a cover story in Business Week 3 years ago. And he never said anything about the skill level problem then, although I know that he talked to the man who identified it, and he told him about it. It was just a typical rah-rah immigration story. So you see, I'm forced in the debate, although I don't get credit for it. I'm the definition of a pioneer, a guy on a covered wagon with an arrow in his back.
What do you do for full-time work?
I'm a senior editor at Forbes magazine, and I'm also a senior editor at National Review. That's kind of moonlighting.
Where do you live?
I live in the New York area.
You say that as if you don't want somebody to know specifically where you live.
Well, of course, I don't want people to know specifically.
And why?
Because this is a rough subject, and I have a young family.
How many children do you have?
I have one little boy who's 3, who's on the back of the book there, and I go on endlessly about him in the book, partly because it's a way of humanizing the concept of 2050, you know. He'll be 59 in 2050, when the country will be changed out of recognition, and partly because I just feel like it. I felt like writing about him. I'm a middle-aged father, so I'm very doting.
What will life be like for him when he's your age?
Well, it's a very interesting question. I mean, this is 2050. The Census Bureau is projecting that first of all, if it's left to Americans of all races, they're all bringing their families down so that the population will be stable. It'll stabilize around 250, 260 million. But it's not been left to Americans. In fact, the Americans have been second-guessed, really, by the government, which is going to drive the population up through immigration to 390 million in 2050. 130 million of those people will be post-1970 immigrants and their descendants. Actually, the high series estimate is 500 million. So his life will be a lot more crowded, for one thing. I don't know if the aquifers are going to be depleted and the water table polluted like the environmentalists say. It's been very educational to me during this book, because it makes me think twice about the environmentalist question, the environmentalists. But I do know it's an amenity issue. You know, California's going to stop being the Golden State and will become the Golden Subdivision.
Are you surprised about the reaction to this book?
No. Well, I'm surprised in one way, Brian. This book has been very widely reviewed. You know, it was the lead review in the Washington Post. It was reviewed twice in the New York Times, once very intelligently by Richard Bernstein. We have a tremendous amount of print reviews, Jack Miles and The Atlantic. I didn't expect that. I thought it would be marginalized. So that tells me that the sort of political elite is concerned about immigration, or they're concerned about public reaction to it. I think that's probably due to Proposition 187 in California, which was the referendum designed to cut off illegal immigrants from welfare. You know, they hit that thing with everything they could, left and right, and they couldn't stop it. They outspent it 30-1, but it still won overwhelmingly. So I think that's really shaken the political elite's faith in their ability to keep control of this situation.
Is there a position on immigration by conservatives and liberals? Is there a difference?
It goes right across the spectrum, is the short answer. There's a real civil war on the right on the question. And there are deep differences on the left, although they're not as openly expressed. I mean, the bravest group in the last 10 years on immigration has been the environmentalists, who are very concerned just because of population growth. And they're normally thought of as a liberal constituency. I used to think of environmentalists, you know, I'm a typical financial journalist, I guess. I used to think of them as just a species of refugee socialists looking for another excuse to push people around. But in fact, it turns out there really are people out there at the grassroots who genuinely, so to speak, who are genuinely interested in trees and prefer trees to people. They're not really political people, a lot of these grassroots environmentalists. And and their point is that, you know, if you increase the numbers, there are going to be fewer trees, and they're right.
If you were to...
The other issue, to finish, you know, immigration is a class issue in this country. You can't show that it benefits Americans overall, but you can show that within the native-born community it causes a redistribution of income. Basically about 2% of GDP is redistributed from labour to capital. So it disadvantages the poor, and then particularly unskilled workers, because most of the influx, the high proportion of the influx has been unskilled. And so there was a real class effect about immigration, and that's another reason why in the past it's been a progressive issue. It used to be a liberal issue, immigration restriction in the 1920s.
If you were going to put two liberals and two conservatives in a room on the issue of immigration, and I don't know if you can do this or not, but name two liberals and two conservatives that would be at each other's throat on this issue. In other words, how this, try to define how it's split, and if you could name the people would help.
Well, on the conservative side, there's somebody like Jack Kemp, if he's still considered conservative, or the editor of the Wall Street Journal, Bob Bartley, who basically take the position that economic growth is a central good, and they just basically haven't gotten the message that immigration doesn't actually benefit economic growth very much. Now, what am I looking for on the liberal side? I'm looking for liberals who don't like immigration.
Split it, you know, like a liberal that doesn't like immigration and one that does.
Okay, I should give you a conservative who doesn't like immigration.
Right.
For example, Paul Craig Roberts, who is a columnist, who's at the Cato Institute.
Where's Pat Buchanan come down?
Well, Pat has just come out in favour of a moratorium on immigration. A very brave thing to do. Unless somebody else moves on this question, I think it could well carry him a long way, much further than people in this town think.
Now, how about a liberal that's against it?
Well, as I say, Brian, the Liberals are much quieter on this issue. But my book is endorsed, as you know, by Gene McCarthy, who says that he very kindly compares me to Tom Paine, who'd only been here less than a year, actually, when he wrote Common Sense.
You say early in the book that Bob Bartley helped get you in this country.
Yes.
And then now you're on opposite sides of this issue.
I'm afraid so.
How did he help you come?
Well, in 1978, he brought me down from Canada to where I was then working to help on the editorial page just for the summer. It was a kind of a summer deal that he used to have. And I needed, of course, it never occurred to me to come illegally. And so I needed a temporary work permit to do that, and he organized that.
Have you argued about this issue, and what does he say now that you're on the other side?
I don't think Bob is talking to me at the moment, but it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell whether Bob's talking to you or not. He's not very sociable. He's not a very sort of gregarious fellow.
So silence is punishment?
That's probably a bad sign, yes. Probably a bad sign.
Another person that's talked about in the book quite a bit is Julian Simon.
Yes.
Who is he, and what side's he on, and why do you disagree?
Well, Julian Simon is perhaps the leading economist on the immigration enthusiast side, just as George Borjas is a leading economist on the other side. He crawls out the same intellectual hole that I do. He's sort of a libertarian, but he just has taken a very pro-immigration line, and my basic disagreement with him is over the numbers. He just hasn't got his data right. He isn't reflecting the recent inflow of immigrants.
Thomas Paine, who you mentioned earlier.
Paine, of course, was the author of Common Sense, the great pamphlet that significantly shaped the direction of the revolution. But he was an Englishman. He was here only a few months when he wrote this thing. He was an English radical.
A liberal.
Well, I guess you'd have to call him a liberal. In some respects, those categories are sort of outdated there now. It's anachronistic.
Academics are only pro-immigration, you say in your book.
Well, it's a very odd thing. There's no very clear there isn't this is a subject which is not insufficiently studied, frankly. We don't know a great deal about immigration simply because people have taken it for granted that it's a good thing. Now, there is a great sea change in the debate among economists. It's becoming clear that there are serious problems with the way the Act is working and the way these immigrants are failing in the workplace. But in softer areas, for example, academic philosophy, I don't believe there's even been one discussion of the moral right that a nation has to defend its borders and, in fact, to protect its family. Because a nation is an extended family. And that's why I feel this idea that, you know, we should just push the blacks aside and import a better class of minority, harder working minorities, which is a common thing, like you hear people say. It bothers me.
What's the number of immigrants that come to this country every year now?
Legal, it's just below 1 million. The last year, I believe, was about 880,000. Illegally, it's 2 to 3 million gross, 3 to 500,000 net. There are about 4.5 million illegals in the country, and the stock is increasing by 3 to 500,000 net. Net legal immigration is very much higher now. It's about 90% than it was at the turn of the century. It's often forgotten that the last great wave of immigration, 40% of those people went back.
And what's the breakdown? Where are people coming from?
Oh, 85% from the Third World. About half and half, Asia and Hispanic, the Hispanic world.
And is everybody still working off the 1965 immigration bill?
Yeah, it's been amended in '86 and 1990, but the system is still basically the same.
What did they do to change it in '85 and '91?
In '86, there was an amnesty of illegals. They thought they would try and get the illegal situation under control, so they amnestied about 3 million illegals who'd been here since before '82. In 1990, there was a particular problem because basically Senator Kennedy needed to legalize a number of illegal Irish who were in the country. So in order to basically do that, he had to increase categories all across the board, so they basically increased the quotas enormously and allowed a larger sort of influx, and 1 or 2 other minor changes. They tried to get at the skill level problem by increasing the skill level of immigrants who come here purely for skills without family connections. But the numbers are still relatively very low because they also increase the family inflow.
You say that there ought to be a moratorium of 5 to 10 years. What does that do, though, for someone that's here and has, say, political asylum and they need to bring their families over here?
Well, you know, it's very bad for them. We don't have good options here. When I say moratorium, I mean no net immigration. About 200,000 legal residents leave a year. So you could have no net immigration with 200,000 immigrants. And that should take care of hardship cases and of any needed skills that there might be required. But there's no doubt that this is a very unpleasant option, and it's been forced upon the country by 30 years of total irresponsibility on the part of the political elite.
You say that in your book that you went out to the San Diego border between this country and Mexico.
Right.
For what reason?
I wanted that sector, the Chula Vista sector, is where some very large proportion of all the illegals come across. You know, the border it's hard to cross the southern border. It's only about 250 miles that are at all passable. Most of it's desert and mountain, which is, of course, why it would be easy to seal. So I went to see this ridiculous performance every night with literally thousands of illegals streaming across at night and the Border Patrol chasing them up and down through the bushes. It's hopeless. I mean, it's a ludicrous spectacle.
What did you find when you got there?
Well, you know, I found all the illegals standing at the border, actually over the border, because the U.S. has fallen back from the border to a more defensible line, waiting for dark and shouting insults at the Border Patrol. And then as soon as it becomes dark, you can see them on the scopes, the infrared scopes, start to swarm across. And the early part of the night, they catch quite a few, but by the end of the night, it's just completely out of control. We could show it on the network news, actually. I mean, because it happens with absolute clockwork regularity.
What would you do to stop it?
Well, I think there should be a physical barrier, for one thing. There was no fence at all there until quite recently. The citizens of San Diego took to driving down to the border and lighting it up with their headlights so that the Border Patrol could see these people. It's a scandalous situation. And it's scandalous in a very particular way, Brian. You know, that border is dangerous. There are smugglers preying on these people. When I was down there, one of the Border Patrol said, you know, not smugglers, I mean bandits, basically, was preying on these people. He said what really upsets him is when he catches these people and he finds that they've already been hit by the bandits and they've stolen the children. I said, stupidly, I said, steal the children? He said, well, they sell them to child prostitution rings. I mean, it's an open sore, morally, that border, because it's not been efficiently policed. You know, good fences make good neighbours. It's amazing to me that you hear people saying that the compassionate thing is to let this flow over the border continue, when in fact it's causing tragedies every night.
What's the history of immigration in the country? You talk about great waves.
Right, right. It's not continuous is the critical point. Immigration actually was quite low in the 18th century. The country was growing very fast through natural increase. And then the mass immigration, there were two great lulls in American history, really. After the revolution to about 1840, and between 1924 and 1965, there was very, very little immigration. But in between, there are lots of other pauses, and those pauses are critical to the process of assimilation. You know, you often hear people say, well, all this was said before about the Irish and the Germans and God goodness knows what, and of course it was. But in every case where it was said before, there was always a pause, and that pause, usually spontaneous, allowed this assimilation to take place.
Why does it change? Why is it up and down?
Well, because it was very closely linked to economic conditions in the US, for one thing, and secondly, very often because of wars in Europe and so on.
Are there certain countries that you would just not let anybody in at all?
Well, you know, one of the embarrassing things that's emerged from the experience in '65 is that there actually are systematic differences in the performance of immigrants according to their national origins. Generally speaking, first world immigrants do much better in the economy than third world immigrants.
Yeah, what's a first world immigrant?
Well, first world is like Austria, for example. Their welfare participation rate is like 2%. Whereas a third world country like the Dominican Republic, the welfare participation is 30%. In some cases, it goes much higher than that. The Cambodians, for example, 50%. Vietnamese, 25%. Even groups we think of being as successful, like the Chinese, the mainland Chinese is over 10%. Koreans over 10%. That seems to be because they've formed the habit of bringing their elderly parents in and dumping them on SSI. But in any case, there is a real pattern here, and it can't be ignored. You could control the performance of the immigrant inflow by controlling the national origins. It's not irrational economically. Of course, I don't imagine that the political system could ever do that, which is one reason why I think we may be at the end of the mass immigration era. The frontier may really have closed.
Can you paint a picture of the makeup of this country?
Now?
Yeah.
It's 75% white, about 10%, 11% black, 3% Asian, the balance Hispanic. Of course, Hispanic is both Asian and Hispanic are sort of very difficult categories because it can include so many people. So many different types of people. It's not really a homogeneous category. But it's something which, if I can finish, should I go on?
Yeah.
Well, it's something which the Hispanic politicians have forced upon the Census Bureau. It's not a linguistic category because they don't all speak Spanish. It's not a racial category because of all races. It's not a cultural category because they come from first world and third world societies. But they want it because it defines Hispanic as broadly as possible. And that's very important for them in terms of organising their constituency and putting pressure on the political system. And that in itself is evidence of how this immigration is producing division in the society. About 35% of all Hispanics, I believe, are foreign-born. It's a minority that's really created by immigration.
Of the 75% that you say is white, where do they come from?
In the U.S.? Now, we're talking about the population that's here already?
Yeah, in other words, what countries do they descend from?
Well, the largest single one is Germany. And the second one is probably Britain. And then Ireland is very high up. Ireland and Italy are very high up. If you include Ireland with Britain, if you had a British Isles category, it's still the largest component. I think there are about 40 or 50 million people of German origin in the country.
How did you go about writing the book?
Well, I just sat in front of the word processor until blood came out of my ears. I mean, I wrote it while I was still working at Forbes, and so it's a lot of weekends and evenings and stuff. They were very, very good about it, particularly considering that the official editorial line of the paper is directly opposed to what I'm saying.
Is directly opposed?
Sure.
Have you had a discussion with Steve Forbes about this, and what's he say?
He said he doesn't agree with me.
Does he care that...
He's been very nice about it.
He always...
I guess we get on... I do certain things that he likes, so he's prepared to tolerate this.
He normally recommends a book every time the magazine comes out. Did he recommend your book?
Now, that's a very interesting question. I must look back and see. I haven't checked up on that.
Random House publishes your book. How did that happen?
Actually, it happened... There was an auction, of course, but it happened, I think, because Harry Evans, who is the head of Random House, of course, is also an immigrant, a British immigrant. And I think in Harry's case, he recognized that immigration was a hot issue because he was editor of the Sunday Times in England, probably the most successful editor of that paper in his history, when immigration was very hot in Britain at the time of the speeches made by Enoch Powell. And he knows what a powerful issue it is. This is a profoundly powerful issue once it gets into politics. It's a party breaker. If the parties don't respond to it, people will form new parties, which is what they did in the 1840s. There's no more powerful issue in democratic politics than immigration.
Where does this country stand in the history of the world on immigration, the numbers of people that have come here from other countries? Is there any other country like it?
Yes, there is actually, although it's often forgotten. I mean, obviously Canada and Australia are made up of immigrants too. And in fact, the Canadian immigration flow right now is actually higher than the US relative to the population and the birth rates, but it's much more controlled. The Canadians have a much more flexible system which enables them to choose, to control the quality of the immigrants in terms of their ability to succeed and support themselves. And also they can vary the numbers year by year. That would actually be a good thing to adopt here. I mean, the point is the system is broke. It's indefensible rationally, so something has to be done.
Is there a total figure of money that it costs this country every year to deal with either the immigrants or the illegal immigrants?
Well, there's a heated academic debate on this subject, but it's been resolved recently by a Cuban immigrant economist called George Borjas at UC San Diego. And he's been able to demonstrate, I think, conclusively that there is a net welfare loss, in other words, from immigration, a fiscal loss. In other words, immigrants cost the government more than they're paying in taxes by about $20 billion a year. Now, he's not counting education in that, because he makes the very conservative assumption that education pays for itself when the people get out and earn more. That's probably untrue, but, you know, we like to be moderate.
What happens when somebody is here illegally? What kind of rights do they have in this country?
Well, they have for practical purposes, they have a lot of rights that Americans have, virtually all of them. And it's quite clear that, in fact, there is a great deal of welfare fraud, and they do get onto welfare. For that matter, it's illegal, you know, for most purposes, for legal immigrants to take welfare within their first 5 years. But the Census Bureau makes it clear that they are. The Census Tract data makes it clear that they are taking welfare.
So if somebody comes here illegally and they apply for welfare and get it, we're not catching them, or we know they're illegal?
Well, every year, you know, there's this thing called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is basically a refund to low-income earners. Every year, the IRS computer, the Internal Revenue Services computer chokes because it's picked up fake Social Security numbers because these people who are applying for this thing are illegal. And so it's been programmed to issue dummy Social Security numbers so that they can get these checks in the mail. The system's collapsed. It's collapsed. There's no serious effort made to enforce it. One of the most amazing statistics I came across in Alien Nation is that the Census Bureau says that of the immigrants who came in since 1980 and became citizens, about a third of them say they can't speak English. Although until 1990, it was normally a condition of becoming a citizen they had to speak English. I mean, there's no serious effort made to enforce this kind of thing anymore.
Do you think people that live here ought to speak English?
Yeah, I do. At least as far as their public relations go. In other words, their public interactions. I think that the government should work in English, and I think that people should be educated in English. Now, what they do in their own time, of course, traditionally in America was left up to them. But you see, there's a real serious problem with creeping bilingualism, with introducing bilingualism into the government offices, which people don't recognize. What it does is it effectively discriminates in favor of the minority language community in terms of people who are hired for jobs, because they are typically the ones who are bilingual. They come in speaking this foreign language, and then they learn English in the American system. So it has powerful consequences in redistributing employment to a government posts and so on towards the minority language community. And people don't recognize that. And it can be very effective. I mean, that's how the Afrikaners basically displaced the English from government posts in South Africa once they got control in the late 1940s. Just insisted on bilingualism. It's a de facto way of discriminating against one group and in favor of another.
You point out in your book that years ago, in the early days of this country, that the number of black Americans was 19%.
Yeah.
Versus 11 or 12 today.
Right. That's right.
What happened in that over the last?
Well, what happened was, first of all, the birth rates of the whites were extraordinarily high, and secondly, there was white immigration into the country, and that brought down That brought down the black share of the population by the beginning of this century to about 10%, and then it was stable right through the middle of the century.
What has happened to the black American with immigration over the years? What impact has it had on he or she?
This is one of the most interesting things, I think, that I was able to sort out in Alien Nation. I mean, there is clearly displacement. We can tell that because the people who are leaving California, for example, are the lower skilled workers, exactly what you would predict if they were facing increased competition in the low skilled labour market. It's actually the third time it's happened to the blacks in American history. It happened in the 1840s when the Irish pushed them out of domestic work in New York. It happened in the 1880s when the new immigrants stopped them entering the jobs in the industrial north. Conversely, Simon Kuznets, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist in the 1970s, he used to argue that it was this pause between 1924 and 1965 that was responsible for allowing the blacks to enter the workforce, integrate economically into the society in the north, because they were able to come up and take jobs which immigrants were no longer taking. It's a real problem. It's not the only problem that the blacks have, of course, in this community, but it is a problem, increased work competition.
What is your reaction when you hear somebody say this book, Alien Nation, is to immigration what the bell curve is to the whole subject of IQ and the different segments of our society and their intelligence level?
Well, I guess I feel good about it because I think Murray and Herrnstein's book, The Bell Curve, was actually very scrupulously scholarly. Nobody else seems to think this in the print media, but I believe it was. And I believe my book is scrupulously scholarly too. I don't believe there's anything in there that anybody's going to be able to refute. We're dealing here with facts and with technical economic arguments which are just not made properly elsewhere.
How about those people that say you, in this book, hand the racists everything that they ever wanted to prove that...
You know, in that case, what they're saying is what racists want is truth. Because this is factual, this book. It's not something that people are going to be able to refute. So the only issue, my attitude is truth is an absolute defense. I don't believe we should be suppressing truth just because we think it's politically correct, frankly. And in the last 30 years, they've done a great deal of that. You know, Brian, you can't get good data on crime, immigrant participation in crime. The fragmentary data indicates that immigrant participation in crime is high. But it's not, you can't get good data because the local government agencies often instruct their police not to cooperate with the INS, not to tell the INS how many, or not to find out how many of these people are immigrants and illegal immigrants. And I think that's a scandalous situation because, in fact, the Justice Department says that immigrant crime, the rise of immigrant crime gangs, is its major law enforcement problem right now.
Someone that we talk about a lot on this show because he is quoted more often probably than anybody else is Alexis de Tocqueville. And once again in your book, there he is. This also was the America described by Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, 1835, an irony given that his name has now been adopted by an immigration economic think tank in Washington, D.C. That de Tocqueville's analysis still has relevance is a tribute to his America's power of assimilation and cultural transmission. Why did the think tank name itself Tocqueville?
Oh, ignorance. I don't think they realized what de Tocqueville thought about immigrants. He was very skeptical about the value of immigrants to the U.S. Of course, there weren't very many then. The America that he looked at was still what it had been at the Revolution. In other words, 60% English, 80% British, 98% Protestant. I'm talking about the white component, which of course was the only component that was engaged in political life. And the fact that what he says we think still has relevance is really a tribute to that community's powers of assimilation. Because it has assimilated and successfully assimilated and remarkably assimilated subsequent waves of immigrants. The problem is that you can't ask it to do miracles, this assimilation process. It will not work without a pause.
Another well-known American politician that we saw a lot of over the last 5, 6, 7 years is Alan Simpson, Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming. What do you think of his position? How would you define his position on immigration, and what do you think of it?
I think his position, Simpson, in a curious way, it strikes me, is not really a politician. I mean, he's approached this issue in a sort of sense of good government. and he's trying to get the inflow under control, and he's basically trying to improve things. But the result of that is, in this kind of environment that existed prior to 187, and prior, frankly, to this book, I think, to a certain extent, was that it was very difficult to discuss immigration without being accused of racism and bigotry and so on, and that was a problem for Simpson. I mean, it did really, he had a very rough ride. So I think he's done the best, as, you know, in the circumstances that were available to him. Now, he's thinking now about further legislation, so we'll have to see what happens. As you know, the Immigration Commission is reporting is going to change the debate here.
When you sat down to write your book, what was your primary source of information?
Intellectually, my greatest debt is probably to George Borjas, UC San Diego, who I believe is a remarkable scholar. In terms of information, census data is very important. And there are a number of studies of immigration and immigration history and the economics. For example, I'm very fond of the Harvard Encyclopedia of American Ethnic Groups, which is a tremendous compendium of scholarship on the subject, edited by Stephen Thernstrom, who nevertheless totally missed the point of the demographic point I was trying to make in the review he gave me in the Washington Post. But still, he said the assimilative mechanism had broken down, so that's progress.
You do analyze the political race of 1992. The Democrats won because the white vote was split by the third-party candidate, Ross Perot. According to the New York Times, Bill Clinton won with an astonishingly low 39% of the white vote, which was 87% of the total vote.
Right.
George Bush got 41% and Ross Perot 20%. These numbers will lose them by me just repeating them. But looking to 1996, what role is the immigration issue going to play, in your opinion?
Let me answer that question twofold. What I was saying there, as you know, Brian, is that voting patterns in this country are determined by ethnicity. In the book I say, and I've got in trouble for saying, that race is destined in American politics, but this is no more or less than the political science reality, that ethnicity is more important here than class, which is important in Europe.
Let me read this line. It might help our audience understand. You say the Clinton administration, this is after you analyze the votes, the Clinton administration is a black, Hispanic, Jewish, minority white, Southerners used to be called scallywags coalition.
Used to call them scalawags, yeah, coalition. And that's literally true. I mean, that's what the exit data seems to suggest about the way the vote goes. The only white group that votes heavily for Clinton is the Jews. A minority of the whites vote for Clinton, but he does carry a majority of all the minority groups, with the arguable exception of the Asians, but their voting is so low that it's hard to tell what's going on. And, you know, this is a profound division in American politics. The Republicans carried the Congress this last time, basically because they were able to become the party of the white majority. And this is the reality. What's happened is that the whites seem to have tipped, and blue-collar workers and so on have migrated out of the Democratic camp and into the Republican camp. And it's a very disturbing thing. I mean, politics do operate on racial lines in this country, which is why, if you muck about with the racial balance, you are altering the political future of the country.
You say this, if the immigration pincers continue to close on America, the Clinton administration's electoral coalition may be a harbinger of politics to come.
Sure. I mean, the only way in which Jesse Jackson is ever going to become president here is if the Rainbow Coalition grows to the point where it can outvote the whites. That's basically what it comes down to.
What's wrong with that?
Well, my view is what's right with it. I mean, you have to go to the whites and tell them this is going to happen because of public policy. It's not going to bring you any economic benefit in particular. You're also going to lose political power. Are you in favor of this?
For years, hasn't everyone played this game of...
I should say, by the way, Brian, this isn't set in stone. I mean, groups do change sides. So it's a question of how well this simulative mechanism works. It's also not clear to me that this Rainbow Coalition is going to hold together because there are deep antagonisms between the various components of it.
Give us more on that.
Well, I mean, I'm very intrigued recently with the conversations that have been going on in the black community about setting up a separate black political party. I think in some senses that might be a rational strategy for them. Because it's a better way of exerting influence. It isn't clear that the Asians again is a big category because it's not just it's not just what we used to call Orientals. It goes right the way over to the Mediterranean. So it's a very heterogeneous category. But it's not clear that they're going to identify with the minorities as opposed to the white majority.
Do you get any sense that people play politics with this immigration issue for purposes of getting votes for their side?
Oh, I think there's a clear public choice explanation, what economists call public choice explanation for what's going on here. I mean, I think one of the reasons, what happens is, it's a classic political science issue. Immigration affects some people a great deal, and the vast majority of Americans only slightly. So the policy has been driven by special interest groups, and that's certainly true in the 1990 Act, which was basically written by special interest groups, all of them expanding their own coalitions here, their own presence here.
How is your life different living here in the United States versus living in Great Britain?
Well, it's much more interesting, for one thing, and much less crowded. Of course, that's going to change.
How?
Well, it'll change because there are going to be more people here unless the policy, unless immigration policy is altered.
But isn't there an awful lot of land here, I mean, for people to live in?
But remember how concentrated the immigrant inflow is. It goes into these 6 states and these 6 areas. So in fact, in these areas, we're going to see a tremendous intensity. I mean, I came down with Steve Forbes on a helicopter recently from New York to Washington, and it's amazing. It's almost continuous now, this Boswash corridor. And when you consider that it's not clear what the benefits to the native-born are from immigration, it's very surprising.
But if people like that, what's wrong with it?
People like what?
Living in this kind of a megapolis that we do here on the East Coast. I mean, people...
Well, do people like having the population of their cities increased by large numbers of immigrants? The opinion polls say overwhelmingly not. But the issue has not been frankly discussed because of what I call in the book Hitler's revenge, you know. The 65 Act was really Hitler's revenge. It was an attempt. The American elites emerged from the war so traumatized, World War II, so traumatized by fighting Nazism that they set about extirpating discrimination. And when it, everywhere they could find it, and when it backfired on them in the 65 Act, when the Immigration Act, when it didn't work in the way, which is a highly discriminatory act because it focuses immigration on just 15 countries, they announced you weren't allowed to discuss it because if you do, you're called a racist. And that's been able to keep the issue out of politics for a long time.
Do you think that, based on what you know...
I'm an immigrant doing a dirty job here.
Do you think in this country that there will ever be a non-white elected president of the United States?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, I do, yeah.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
It depends who he is. It depends who he is. But no, I don't think this is a racist country. I flatly don't think it is. I think the Americans are remarkably tolerant. The problem with this kind of public policy, of course, is that it's driving their tolerance too far. You know, there's a great uproar in Florida at the moment because of basically Castro has been able to force the Clinton administration to swallow 20,000 Guantanamo refugees and to also, not unnoticed generally, to accept a floor on Cuban immigration of 20,000 a year. But they're stopping them on, the Americans are going to stop them on the high seas, these rafters. Well, the problem is, of course, 20,000 is not a high number for America to accept, except they all go to southern Florida. But the country is so overwrought by immigration, and particularly in Florida, which is a major impacted state, that people just want an absolute cutoff. That's what happened in the 1920s. I mean, the cutoff was so absolute and ruthless because the country was so overwrought, because the politicians would not respond to their complaints, that it became impossible to let even the Jews from Hitler's Germany in, who were the ultimate victims of this, you know, tremendous irresponsibility on the part of the political elite and the media elite.
Since this book has been out, has anybody said anything about you didn't like? You really didn't like?
Well, I'm not particularly keen on people reading from Mein Kampf and trying to show parallels between my book and Mein Kampf, which has happened. Although, it's something that I was prepared for because I know how hysterical immigration enthusiasts can get. I haven't found anybody who's broken through the factual side, but that's not surprising because it was read by all kinds of academic readers before we went to press.
What do you think the motive is of someone who really likes immigration? Well,
you can think of all kinds of motives, and they may themselves be immigrants who want to see more of their own people in here, and that's a commonly and widely accepted thing, apparently, that immigrants can advocate more immigrants coming in. They just don't like them advocating less immigrants coming in. I think also that the opposite of nativism is alienism. There are some people who are deeply alienated from American society, and they look to immigration as a way of transforming that society. You know, I often trap people into this because I say to them, there's no economic motive for this immigration, so what's your motive? And they'll say things like, well, I didn't like it when it was an all-white society. I quote Earl Raab, the columnist in this book, saying that the great thing about immigration is it makes impossible the rise of a Nazi party. in America because it's introduced so many minorities into society. And I like this explanation because it's rational. There's a rational explanation as to why we should have immigration. My only further point is we should now go to the American people and ask them, is that okay with them?
What's your wife think of the reaction to this book?
I think her principal concern is that I not be murdered while I'm on the book tour. But at the moment, I'm doing okay.
Does she work?
Well, she's about to have, thank God, a second baby, which is much more important than the book.
Do you think she'll ever become an American citizen?
You can never tell with Canadians, but Pat Buckley did, so there's hope.
Are you writing a second book?
Well, I would be murdered by my wife if I do another book. This is my third book, actually my fourth book. I was helping Rupert Murdoch write a book some years ago, and it was finished, but it was never published.
Why did he not publish it?
Well, basically he got cold feet, but that's okay, he paid me.
What was the book about?
It was about him. It was sort of an as-told to autobiography.
Is it still there possibly to be published later?
I'll have to ask him sometime. We see him from time to time. I've also done, as you know, Brian, a book on Canadian politics and a book on investment letters. Well, that was a very technical investment book.
This is what the book looks like. It's called Alien Nation. And our guest, Peter Brimelow, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
Peter Brimelow's most recent book is called The Worm in the Apple: How the Teachers' Unions Are Destroying American Education. For more information on Alien Nation, visit the publisher's website, harpercollins.com. Next week on Encore Book Notes, New York Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton. She sat down with us while she was First Lady to talk